Welcome back to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, and Tim Padgett and I are talking today more about my conversation with Matthew Clark. That was about God's gift of time. Tim, welcome back to Upstream.
Thank you very much. It was a good conversation.
I love how in your notes you mentioned a mutual friend of ours whose sense of time can often make him just an incredible conversation partner, but you have to be careful when you're running short on time because he just loses track of himself. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. And you and I have worked with him and we've been in meetings and it's sometimes like, come on, get to the point there. But, yeah, and it's just rarely, he never says anything uninteresting or ill-informed. I don't always agree with him, but it really does point to this thing about time, because when time is constrained, when time is limited, conversations with our friend can be frustrating at times. But you and I have both had times where we have spent hours just conversing with him. There's we joke about the fact that there's nothing he doesn't know. There's nothing he hasn't read. And it just, you wish you had like a whole weekend. Like we should arrange a weekend of you, me, another mutual friend and him, and just to talk. And it would be a wonderful thing. But it points to the limitations of time. We don't always have that option. We don't always have 4 hours. And you and I have been at those conferences and things like that, where we've sat with him for 2-3 hours and talked about the ranking of officers in tribal confederations and the Arizona Indians to Dune,
right,
to everything under the sun. And he has an informed opinion about all of it. And it's great. But again, you have to have that long time. Otherwise, you're missing something. It is a beautiful thing. It's a good example of time and all of that.
He's a bit like one of Tolkien's Ents.
Mm-hmm.
Merry and Pippin are asking, "Oh, have you decided whether you're going to go to war against Isengard or not?" And Treebeard tells them, "To war? Decided what? No, we've just finished saying good morning at the Entmoot." And it's like 10 o'clock at night. It's perfect. But there's great wisdom in that. And the contrast between those two approaches is something worth discussing a little more fully. In fact, you said in your notes, Tim, that we have this responsibility at times to stop and smell the roses, but we also have the responsibility to, fulfill our obligations and to manage our time well, and even to watch that dreaded clock at seasons of our lives. Where's the balance from a Christian wisdom perspective? What are the upstream questions you think we ought to be asking about our time and our willingness to spend it well?
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. I think that there is a lot of stuff where we can borrow here from. I mean, you had talked in your conversation about the linear concept of time that you get from the Bible. And that's a very key thing. I think we should discuss that further. But I think that the cyclical view of time has its advantages. As a macro story, it's problematic. And we can talk about that later. But as micro story to your days, your weeks, your months, your years, your seasons, it's actually really healthy. I think it gives us a rootedness, because I rise in the morning and it's time for me to work. And I work for hours, and then evening comes and it's time for me to stop. It's time for me to go to bed. It's time for me to play with my children. Again, you have 4 kids, I have 4 kids. Time is a premium thing. We don't have as much time to do the work we would like to do. We don't have enough time to spend with our children as much as we should. And I think that having that understanding that there's seasons in life across the board, I think is the good way. This is, well, to borrow, I used this, I think, as illustration before, but when you talk about the White Witch in Narnia, the problem wasn't that she made it winter. It was winter without Christmas, and it was winter unending. So, I mean, without Christmas, lack of joy, all kind of thing. But it was also winter that didn't stop. There should be those times when you get up and you put your shoulder to the plow and you work up a sweat. I mean, you and I put our shoulders to the keyboard or the book or something like that, but it's the same principle. We strive in that area. But we do put forward that effort. But then there should be the time when we stop. And it is, in a sense, ungodly to not stop, to not get that rest. I wrote a column for the Colson Center 4 years ago, I think now. Actually, you would like it. I deal with Tolkien, Fellowship of the Ring a lot. But talking about the importance of stopping and resting, the difference between godly rest and a ungodly laziness. because, we'll sketch through what I said about the Lord of the Rings. The hobbits, they leave the Shire, they go along, they strive through the forest, which is pushing them back into it's hard work, and they get to Tom Bombadil's house, and they rest. And then they go further, and they go further, and they have more adventures, and they get to Rivendell, and then they rest. And then they go through all the travails, they go through the Mines of Moria, they get to Lothlorien, and then they rest. And at the end of their journey, they're finally able to fully rest. Having those cycles, recognizing that we are creatures. And I think that one of the key things that we need to understand with the 10 Commandments, 10% of the 10 Commandments is God saying, take a break. That should tell us something that I don't think it's not talking to 21st century North American workaholics, but it is talking to people who might try to find in their own labors, their own efforts, their own security. And so it is saying stop. Now, mind you, Proverbs is full of admonitions to work, 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 work. So it's both of those in tension. It means, I think I said in the notes, we need to work to the point. The end of the day means something. The end of the week means something. The end of the time of vacation, a holiday, that we should work hard enough, work yourself tired, not exhausted. We work ourselves being aware of how long we're working, what we're working for, and then get that rest, because we don't help God if we burn ourselves out. And that's, I think, something to keep in mind, is having that balance of work and rest, both being part of our godly responsibility.
It's interesting that we're really talking about ways of allocating or using or viewing time. It's not like Hebrew time or American 21st century time or Babylonian time are any different in that sense. We're all in the same time sequence. Things progress for all of us at the same speed and always have. It can feel different because of the way we allocate and view time and the way that our society allocates and views time. So in some ways, we're talking about that. And I guess if you make the decision to prioritize certain things over, say, efficiency or material productivity or being, quote unquote, on time for all sorts of meetings and events, then everyone's going to have those same expectations. So it won't seem rude. You have a clash when you got different expectations that people fail to meet because they're from different cultural contexts and they're answering those questions about time differently. But you said, before we move on from this subject of like using time, you said this, and I thought it was really provocative and something good to remember for those who, like me, just, really want to kick back and hang out with friends and not worry about the dishes. You said, it'd be great if we could all spend hours each day pondering the sunset or reading a good book or painting a picture or have a long, slow conversation with a friend, but we can't. We have dishes to wash, tasks to complete, children to raise, and on and on. There are indeed times when we can do that, but those are evenings or meals or weekends or vacations and so on. Frankly, the people whose lives are defined by such levels of downtime usually can only do so because others are working far more frantically. Kind of the Martha and Mary question, right? Who's sitting there doing the contemplation and who's doing the dishes? And I would point out, even though your observation is good, that Jesus comes down on the side of the contemplation in that scenario. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's a very good observation, and there definitely can be there's a lot too many Marthas. I think there's lots of ways to be Martha. However, this might be an exegetical hermeneutical thing. I don't think that passage is fundamentally about the life of contemplation versus the life of labor. I think it's fundamentally about what is it that Mary is doing. Mary is waiting on the Lord. What is Martha doing? She's working for the Lord. The problem isn't that she's working for the Lord. She is deciding how she's going to work. She is self-defining what her service and labor should be to God. And she's upset that Mary isn't along for the ride. Mary, on the other hand, is constantly seen in this context of waiting. She's waiting in that instance. She's waiting at the time of Lazarus. And so it's showing her life, her labor is centered on the word of Jesus, whereas her sister's labor is centered on the labor that she sees herself as doing for her. But that being said, it is very easy, I think, in certain theological constructs, ours in particular, to see work for God, maximizing the time, right? Redeem the time. There's all sorts of things that can be good and can be misused greatly. I mean, you and I are both good Calvinist boys, and it is said that when Calvin was near death, someone, he worked himself to death, basically, that someone said, you need to rest. You should stop. He says, should I Like, would the Lord come and meet me and find me, slacking or whatever the phrase was? But so you can definitely have in that kind of strong reformed world, I will work, 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 work. That's my service to God. Work myself exhausted. If I die in the process, so be it. Well, I mean, admirable work ethic, but again, 10% of the 10 commandments are rest. And if we are seeing if we're being we can be Martha, in that we work, 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 and defend ourselves. We defend ourselves by our work, justify ourselves by being work. I think I mentioned before, there was a time in seminary when I realized I was just seeing my own, not salvation justification, but justification as a man, as a human being, by how stressed I was. And that is, the more stressed I was, the better I felt, because it was, that's not good. And like literally having bags under my eyes was to me a sign of pride. And that was sin. I mean, because I am not my own. I mean, that's the thing. My labor is not my own, and I need to work for God. But also, if I work myself to exhaustion, I'm no good. To my comment about the thing about being the provocative element, I mean, that's something we have to keep in mind. When does poetry get written? You have to have time to write poetry. You have to have time to think, to paint a picture, to do science, to do all of these things. It takes time and reflection. You and I can't do our jobs without times of reflection. But that means we have to do a lot of work where other people are supporting us. I think that's something we have to bear in mind.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I wonder if the kind of work we're doing affects the sense of busyness and our perceived lack of time. And so back a moment ago, we referred to the cyclical nature of much timekeeping historically. And many books have observed that was centered around an agricultural economy. So when you have a cycle of the days and your work takes place within that determined natural cycle, the cycle of day and night that God himself instituted, because you can't work the field in the dark. So you work it during the day. You have a cycle of the season. So you have planting to harvest, and that is set by the seasons themselves, by the temperature and by the sunlight during the day and rainfall and all that stuff. So you're bound to that. And once that's done, there simply is no more to do on that task. And if you don't conform yourself to the external rhythm of cyclical type that is imposed on you from without, by nature itself, then you're going to be a terrible farmer and you're going to starve. That's just how it is, right? And that changes. I love the cyclical nature of things set within a linear timeline, because, right, even our lives have a cyclical nature to them. It's like the circle of life sort of observation. Like we are babies, we reach middle age, we get old, we die, we have kids in the process, and then it starts all over again. So there's a clear circularity to it. But of course it moves on. Things change. We're not the same people from day to day, and our kids are not the same people as us. And it's all moving in a direction. But this divorce from the natural rhythm of things and the type of work we do as a result is interesting to me. I forget the book I was reading. I think it may have been, well, maybe in a lecture that I heard. It's all kind of blending together at this point. But there was an observation I heard from someone recently that if someone in the recent past were to look at a clock, one of the early clocks, and say, okay, it is now 10 p.m. I need to go to bed right now, is what they would have said. They would have said, it's now, I look outside, I'm corresponding that to the clock that I see in front of me. And well, the sun's telling me it's time to go to bed. So I'm going to go to bed. The modern person with electric lights and internet and caffeine and all the different mechanisms that we use to manipulate time in more aggressive ways looks at those 2 hours and says, I have 2 hours here that I can work. And I can probably jigger my sleep in such a way that this becomes possible now. So your own limitations, or your perceived limitations, become greater. Your possibilities are broadened in a way that people long before us just could not have achieved. You just can't stay up and look at a piece of paper or a book for that long, because you don't have the light. You can't do it. So I wonder about the type of work we do, and then the more subtle ways that affects us. So electric lights is one transition, but a more recent transition that's happened is the internet has brought work to our homes and to these devices in our pockets. So when we perceive our work time not as the time between clocking in and clocking out at the office, but for, you and I do quite a bit of remote work. We don't really have a set office necessarily. And some days there just is no office. It's our devices. How does that affect us? And what do we need to be on guard for if time is a gift and if we're not in charge of the gift entirely?
Yeah. I mean, when you were talking there, it reminded me, I think it's a Neil Postman line. He said that if he could write an 11th commandment, it would be, thou shalt not make an artificial time recorder or whatever it was. Basically saying he thought it was horrible that we invented clocks. Now, of course, he's using some hyperbole there, but he's recognizing something. There have been problems with that. I mean, just to give you a very practical example, the financial controller here recently sent me an email asking about how many days I had taken off this year, because we get, X amount and I'd only taken, Y amount or something like that.
I got that email too.
Yeah. Well, I think that gets to your point is like in a more even just a generation ago, our father's times or whatnot, the vacation was a particular time, whereas, time off, it would take a particular thought to take time off. Where, again, I was telling my wife just last night, the difference between, I'm reading a book by Tom Holland right now. Am I reading that because it helps me with my work? Am I reading that because it helps with a paper I'm doing at a theological conference here in 2 weeks? Am I doing it just because I want to do it? Well, yeah. Now, there's a virtue in that because it means my pleasures and my productivity are aligned well. But it means, when am I off the clock? You're right. I mean, I sometimes see me here in Mountain Time. I see you posting something on Twitter late my time, and then I'm often up pretty early myself. And so this sort of work does enforce or does allow or enforce odd hours. As if we were farmers. Yeah, you're right. I mean, one of my favorite stories about like the difference of time, actually two. One's just quirky, and the other was told as a criticism. There's a scholar of Islam, his name is Bernard Lewis, and he was talking about the difference between this is going back centuries, Western and Middle Eastern understandings of time. He said that he was talking about a couple of Westerners who were traveling through the desert with some, I think it was Arabs through the desert. And in the middle of the night, they went down to sleep when the sun went down. Logically, if you're camping, you have to go to bed at dark, right? Well, they were out in the middle of nowhere. The sun went down. There was some sort of astronomical phenomenon. I don't know if it was like an extra thing of aurora borealis or meteor shower or something like that. But the sky lit up. And so what did the Arab guys do? Well, they got up and they started walking again. He's treating that as a criticism, but they don't know how long it's been. I mean, here's a thought. I went camping and my phone died. So I was asleep with my kids in the tent, because when they're little, you can't leave the tent. I had no idea how long time had passed, because you fall asleep. Has it been 5 minutes? Has it been 5 hours? It shows you how keyed I am to this little glowing rectangle in my pocket. The other story is from Northern Europe, and there's some historical reference to this about second sleep. I don't know if you've heard of this, but like that, it's Northern Europe in the middle of winter. The sun goes down at like 3:30 and doesn't come up until 10 or whatever it is, or if it's far north. And you don't have to sleep that much. And it's winter, so you're not doing heavy labor. So they'd go to sleep when it got dark, and then they'd wake up again, and they'd be up for a few hours and talk, do whatever, have a snack, and then they'd sleep again. And it just shows what a different world we live in. If you live in some major metropolis, either, the east or west coast of the U.S., some places in Europe, or a place like South Korea or Japan, you never are in darkness. It's always, you're perpetually surrounded by light. And that's got to do a number on your psyche, because we might be more productive with clocks and things like that by being able to ignore the sun and the circadian rhythms. But we're built for that. We're built for hunter-gatherer agricultural societies. You wonder what that can do to us. Well, your recent guest, Matthew Clark, when he was here, and then a couple of the other people, there was part of me that wanted to push back, because there's a virtue to operating by the clock. There's a virtue to being able to say, the sun's down, but I can keep working. And that's 2 hours extra work. That means it's extra labor, extra leisure at another time, either that I can give to somebody else or free time for me labor. There's a virtue in that. There's a virtue to Western time of you show up if you're supposed to be there at 8, that means you're there 5 to 8 or 10 to 8, as opposed to Africa time or Trinity time or whatever you call that. There's a virtue to that, because we're able to create this productivity, which enables us to do so much more. On the other hand, again, we're designed for a world that's keyed to the sun and the moon and the seasons and stuff like that. And so, I mean, just think if you worked and lived in an urban area, someplace like San Diego, the weather never changes. It's always the same temperature. It's always light and stuff like that. I wonder what the psychological studies are on people who live in environments like that.
Yeah, well, even evolutionary biologists and materialists will point out that human beings are not made to live by the kind of rhythms and light patterns that we're living by. You have all around the beaches here in Florida, you have these signs that say basically don't shine bright lights out to sea at night, especially during the summer. And you can't even have campfires on the beach during the summer because that's sea turtle nesting season, and they rely on the moon to guide them wherever they're going by the cycle that they're on. If there's a big bright light shining inland from inland instead of out at sea, they get confused. They get turned around, and next thing you know, they're like in a storm drain or something. It's really sad. At the end of the day, we're not any different biologically than any of God's other creations that are designed to do what they do. And we are designed to be diurnal creatures that live on a 24-hour cycle that sleep 8 to 9 hours a night. And that's just what we are. We can't change that. If we try to change it, we're doing violence to ourselves. So yeah, there's a great deal of pushback to be had against the modern way of doing things and the illusion we have that we can create more time out of the set pie that we have. It's the same pie that our ancestors, hundreds and thousands of years ago had. We don't have more hours in the day. We're just chopping it up differently and kind of diluting ourselves at times and hurting ourselves in the process.
This will appeal to you, I think, with your nature love. I think this is a good way to kind of tease out that what there is different between us and our other mammalian friends. I was at a conference once and talking about the difference. I'll try and track down the recording of it. I think you'd love it. The difference between animal intelligence and human intelligence. And we look at apes and elephants and all these animals who can do wondrous things. But how much of it is actually intelligence and how much of it is purely instinct? One of the most remarkable creatures, is the beaver, right? They can build all these amazing things. We've read Chronicles of Narnia, of course. We've seen nature documentaries. It's amazing stuff. But this one guy brought up that they had a beaver in a room and they put the sound of running water and a speaker in the room. And they put a bunch of wood in there. And the beavers did what you think they did. They took the wood and built a dam around the speaker. And they are so tied to pure impulse, to pure instinct, that they can do something amazing, but they're not thinking it through. And I wonder what there is, the difference between us, because while we're not wholly separate from them, we're not that either. We build superfluous things. We build amazing things beyond. No beaver is going to really come up to a fundamental difference over what his ancestors built. Whereas architecture, science, all that stuff, humanity is always building. And I wonder, here's where the cyclical and the linear come to play. The cyclical we have to pay attention to for kind of our health, our day-to-day health, our everyday health. But in terms of a culture, maybe it's that we have to have this linear view. Because if you have a purely cyclical view, you have no expectation, hope, or even desire for change. No desire for progress. No desire for making sure that my children have more food available, so that if one of them wants to be a poet, that's fine. And so that teasing those out together, I think, is worthwhile.
That's good. I like this discussion. I want to move us into, for a few minutes, a discussion about God himself, because we've covered human beings and our relation to time. But you had some interesting comments in your notes about God's relationship with time. So C.S. Lewis he was the first one I heard express this, but he's just repeating Augustine's idea, which is that God is not in time. Lewis says, almost certainly God is not in time. And he says this in the context of Mere Christianity, at least, of a discussion of how God can possibly hear everyone's prayers at the same moment. And he says, notice that the whole sting of that question comes in with the phrase, at the same moment. He replies that God is almost certainly not in time, that his life is not dribbled out moment by moment like ours, that he actually has all of eternity, if you like to put it that way, to listen to the split-second prayer of a fighter pilot that's put up during the last moments before his plane crashes in flames. He's writing this in the context of the Second World War. So it's a great example. But God simply has all of eternity to listen to, if you want to put it that way, all of the prayers of everyone who's ever lived. It was, for him, it's simultaneously 1940 and 1960, like he said. So, that's a proposition, a theological proposition that's not taught explicitly anywhere in the Bible, but is sort of drawn out of it, has been by theologians. But you mentioned, Tim, that there are some other weird and wacky ideas about God's relation to time and then human will and decisions and freedom as a result of that. Could you kind of explain those to us and why you prefer the Augustinian gloss?
Well, I prefer Augustinian because he's Augustine, right? No, that's the way to go.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah, the definitive rule is if you're talking about the grass or the city, you say Augustine. If you're talking about the saint, you say Augustine.
Well, see, it gets complicated because there's two St. Augustines. There's Augustine of Canterbury and there's Augustine of Hippo. And usually makes no difference, just to keep them straight in my mind. Augustine of Canterbury, Augustine of Hippo. That's just the rule I have for myself. I think I picked up from a church teacher. But yeah, I think that these things are really hard to track with because you, in your discussion, you were talking about that music requires time, right? And I thought it was actually a very keen insight because if you took all the notes of even the shortest song imaginable, Mary Had a Little Lamb, just something like that, and played them all at the same time, it's just noise, right? We can't conceive of a world that's not sequential. It's so part of our nature. Good nature, yes, unfallen nature. This is part of who we are. We simply can't conceive of lots of things happening at the same time. If you remember the mildly blasphemous movie Bruce Almighty, you've got Jim Carrey and Morgan Freeman as God, which is fun, of course, because he's got that great voice. But there's an instance where all the prayers are uploaded to him as emails when Bruce Almighty takes on the job, right? And he starts to answer them one by one. And then he uses his God superpowers and he's like typing really, really, really fast. And he gets done and he realizes this is even more than they were when he began. And so you think about there's 8 billion people on the planet and however many, all this kind of stuff. It's hard for us to conceive of that. And so I think that that's a very good image of that.
The best lesson from that movie was the part where he says yes, in essence, to every prayer request. And then the world is burning the next day because it doesn't work out.
Right. Yeah. It was a beautiful thing. I mean, it again, mildly blasphemous or not so mildly, but it had a couple of good lessons. But yeah, I mean, I think that just shows why it's hard for us to track with a timeless God. And many Christian philosophers and theologians have teased to try to figure this out. In some of them, I had a professor, he taught both theology and philosophy at Trinity, and he said he didn't think that God could be timeless because otherwise, how could he be in relationship to us? Because again, how could we be genuinely in a relationship with someone who is equally present 1,000 years from now and 10,000 years ago? How is there any sort of relationship with that? And so some people, they say that he's always been in time. Time is just a feature, just like numbers are kind of eternal after a fashion, that time is eternal after a fashion. Now, I think that's making an assumption, that's trying to judge how God's nature must be based on our limitations. And I think that that's not quite fair. That's kind of a mild example of this. Actually, some people, another version of that is that God is by nature, divine nature, timeless. However, upon creation, he enters into time with us, whether wholly or in part. That's a little bit of a medium area in there. The more extreme example is something that just a few years ago was a very prominent thing within evangelicalism. It was called open theism. It was kind of like taking Arminianism, if people are familiar with the Calvinist-Arminian debate there, taking it to its illogical conclusion, saying that human freedom was paramount. That God would never override our will. Human freedom was of vital importance, and because otherwise we're not persons. And God says we're persons, so we must be. So if God speaks of the future and knows of the future, and God can't be wrong, then there's no way. If God can't be wrong and he's seen the future, then we don't actually have freedom because we're going to do what he's already foreseen we are going to do. Therefore, in this thinking, God must not know the future. That's a kind of a radical version of timelessness. That God cannot even see beyond the moment. What he can do is calculate probabilities to a very high degree.
very good at math is a significant downgrade from saying God is omniscient.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, it was an idea that was kicked around for a few years and basically was shut down. People came up and said, okay, here's why that's wrong. But each of these is an attempt to deal with the relationship of God and time to us. But I think that I think that the Augustinian and Louisian answer there is the one that makes the most sense, because God says, I'm the same today, yesterday, and forevermore. He speaks of knowing the future with absolute certainty. If he's not in the future, could there then be? We are left in the position of an open theism. If he is not beyond our time, if he's not beyond our time in one sense, then there could be something that he hasn't expected. It puts a limitation on him. But I think fundamentally what it does is it assumes that something that is intrinsic to our nature must also be intrinsic to his. And I think that's a leap, fundamentally. It's an attempt to describe the nature of God based on our limitations. And I think that, again, that is a leap. It's like what Richard Dawkins says, the Trinity can't be true because it doesn't make any sense to him.
And we would call that, speaking of God, univocally, the same way as we speak of created things. And it comes right up against the central scriptural moment of the burning bush, where the typical Christian translation of what God says there is, I am that I am, or I am who I am. And it's like a statement, a profound and mysterious statement of God's nature as an everlasting present, or an everlasting being that simply is. There is no becoming to God. So I want to run this by you, because in the course of my getting ready for this episode, I posted a thing on Twitter. It was like a poll about whether angels are in time or not. Angels and demons, the spiritual realm, fallen angels, whatever, everybody in that realm, powers, principalities, thrones, dominions, are they in time like we are? Or are they outside of time like God is? Because Lewis has these interesting hints or suggestions that our experience is very different from the angelic experience. So he says this in Screwshaped Letters. He says this in the Space Trilogy. So that was my question. And the replies pointed me toward a lot of things, but one of them was Thomas Aquinas's concept of aviternity. I think I'm pronouncing that right, which is he conceived of it as a separate third thing from earthly time versus God's eternity. He said this is something different in which angels and heavenly beings sort of live. And I got linked in the course of this to a blog post by Christian philosopher Ed Feser. And he explained, as best I could understand, this was very dense stuff, but his explanation was that time itself is to speak of time as a thing is sort of a concession to our limitedness. It's sort of a figure of speech. He says that from an Aristotelian perspective, which is where he's coming from, time is nothing more than the sum of changes, of potential becoming being or actuality in changing things. So he said, imagine a universe where only a banana exists. The only thing exists is a green banana. That's it. And it is in all respects identical to our universe other than the isolation of that banana. If that banana stayed green forever, then he said there would be no time. There's no third thing outside of the banana that is causing it to go yellow and then finally brown. He said time is just what we call the pace of change that created things undergo. So he said the same thing is true of our universe, where everything changes gradually, going from the green banana to the brown banana, or going from a baby to an adult. And it's just things changing. And God doesn't change because he is who he is. And so therefore, he's not subject to time. Or what he said was, that is the same thing as saying God's outside of time. It's just a figure of speech because we're making time into be this sort of spatial thing, which it's not. We're just trying to explain one metaphor by using another metaphor. And it's right. This is what happens when you do philosophy and metaphysics. It just gets very weird. But I found that really helpful because he's just saying there is no such thing as time. It's not a medium that we're in so much as the fact that we change because we are changing things. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that's definitely interesting. If for nothing else, it's a good thought experiment to kind of think through. I mean, it's fair to say that at least if there was a place where nothing changed, there'd be no way to know that nothing was changing. I mean, it just is. And so, yeah, there's so much of it. You think about, like, again, that does at least seem to fit with God's statement, is that he's not anything. He is just, I mean, he's a subject without object in that sense. So there is that timelessness. And I think there's lots of metaphors we can use, but I mean, so much of it is beyond us. One metaphor I've thought of is that, like, I'm here in an office building here, right? And if you have an office building, or think of a hotel room, in the hallway, it's one place, right? The hallway is one. You can go into each individual room, and there's a sequence in that. Room 213, room 214, to whatever. And so I think we can think of time and timelessness like that each of these little rooms, these little doorways that you step into, is the sequence that's going on. But if you're in the hallway, they're all equally present. And I think that's one way to look at it. Or you look at, I mean, some people say it's like looking at that God looks at us the way we look at something we've written. I mean, looking here at my tablet here, and I can look at all the words at the same time. Now, the metaphor fails because as a human being, I can only look at a very small portion of what's here, but God can see it all. It's all equally present. I don't know. I mean, I would hesitate on that because I think that I like the element of time as a spatial thing, borrowing a little bit more from Einstein sorts of things and relativity, because you do see stuff in the physical world where high velocity and high gravity can be measured. I mean, you can measure that they affect the rate of time. There's a famous story where airplanes, they took them off and flew them back, and they had like atomic clocks, and they were offset from each other. So there is something that's measurable about time that's concrete. There's a spatialness to it.
Well, gravity supposedly affects time as well, is one of the principles in relativity, is that's one of the variables that you can mess with in the equation. So if I think it is, I think in a high gravity environment, time passes slower, right? So, if you're out in the middle of space away from any object, then more time is gonna, or maybe it's the opposite. I'm just thinking of Interstellar. That's in my. Remember the scene where they're on this planet where time goes really fast, right? Yeah.
They go down, and the passage of gravity affects things. Yeah, so they go down into a high gravity place. Time for them is actually going slow, but it's continuing higher above the guy, and he comes back, and they think it's been like a couple of hours, and for him it's been 5 years or something insane like that. So you do see that, and I think that put this in my notes. It gets into the questions, these deep waters questions of like, who am I? Am I the same person, literally, that when you and I first met about 5 years ago? Well, I'm almost entirely a different physically. I mean, I look roughly, I'm a little grayer, but I look roughly the same as I did at that point. But almost entirely, my physical makeup is different. And you wait a few more years, and except for, I think you even mentioned this, except for your tooth enamel or something like that, you're an entirely different being, physically speaking. Am I the same thing?
Yeah. Well, you're not a ship of Theseus. That's how you prove that human beings are more than just the stuff we're made of, because otherwise you literally are not the same person that you were 20 years ago.
Right, because I'm made up of different things. So I think you can, with time, you can play with that a little bit, using time as almost as a similar thing to space, having a spatial quality. Because in this sense, I am the person that is my location. I am here in Colorado Springs. I am this tall, this wide, getting wider every day. But I'm all, my dad bod's in full effect here. And I'm also the same being that was created in my mother's womb through the 9 months from April of 74, July of 73. And so I am that being it's not that I was that and I will be something else. I am all of that in a sense at the same time from an outside perspective. And these are some deep, heavy waters we've got going here.
Well, this is one of the reasons also why it would be so difficult to be a materialist, because to believe that matter and energy are all that exist is to actually believe that you are not real. You as an entity is an illusion, an epiphenomena of whatever neurons you currently have. You're not actually the person you were when you were born in any metaphysically meaningful sense, because your material's been replaced. So yeah, right.
Have you seen the movie Dark City? Okay, it's a sci-fi movie. It's kind of you might say it's a precursor to The Matrix. It's got Rufus Sewell, Kiefer Sutherland, I forget who else. And it's in this world where turns out aliens are messing with people's minds, and they are implanting memories and taking memories out, and they're completely changing the physical environment and all this kind of stuff. It's like, who are you? If you're a materialist, there is no you there. And it's a great sci-fi thing. It's kind of creepy. It's kind of this neo-noir vibe. All the styles are like the 1940s, early 50s. And it does make you think, like, who are you? Are you your memories? Are you all these things? Am I the same person that I was 10 years ago? Well, we informally say no, right? I've changed, all this kind of stuff. But if we don't have that, that's a scary place to be if you're a materialist, if all you are, because there's no way to know your neurons haven't been played with.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this has been a good conversation, Tim. We are out of time. There's my dad side coming out. I think this is worth discussing a lot more. I'd love to have some more guests on in the future. So if you've got somebody who is just like a real big, expert or has interesting reflections on the issue of time and theology and human freedom and just how our view of time affects our values and our worldview, then I'd love to hear from that person and talk a little bit more about this on Upstream. So thank you.
Absolutely. Hey, we'll be up here for ETS here in a couple of weeks, and there'll be lots of people there who probably could, the Evangelical Theological Society, and there'll be lots of people there who can probably have that conversation.
I can't wait. I'd love to bring my microphone. We'll see if I can make that happen. Thanks, Tim.